Thank you so much for having us. It's wonderful to be here again, being able to speak with all of you. As we do with these presentations, each year we like to do something very cutting edge. We like to talk from the absolute leading edge of our research data. And this year is going to be no exception. In fact, it's so leading edge that we're going to be talking about an experiment that isn't even fully done yet. It's only part of the way through. So we're going to be talking about the results from the first part of it, which I think are really quite promising and quite extraordinary, even in terms of what we've seen before. We're, of course, very well known in part of our research for a meditation and positive psychology and cognitive science exercises based protocol that, and a protocol, for those of you that don't know what that is just a list of things that you do, right? And so it's basically just like a list of steps. And that protocol produces a really extraordinary sense of well-being in people. It produces a very fundamental shift. In the past, these things were called things like enlightenment, non-duality, persistent mystical consciousness, unity consciousness. There were hundreds and hundreds of terms for this all over the world. Our project is secular and scientifically derived and scientifically based. So we use different terms for those. In the science community, we use the term persistent non-symbolic experience most often, sometimes ongoing non-symbolic experience, depending upon how long someone has been in it and stuff like that. We don't need to go into those details today. There's plenty of other stuff from us all over the web on this type of stuff, as well as on our main website, nonsymbolic.org, that deals with our research and all of that. For the public, we tend to use the word fundamental, or the phrase fundamental well-being. Persistent non-symbolic experience is a little bit of a mouthful for the public. This conference is a scientific society's conference, but the public is invited. And so I'm not actually sure which to use today. I think we'll just use them both. So we'll use PNSE, which is the acronym for persistent non-symbolic experience, and we'll use fundamental well-being, and we'll abbreviate that FW on the slides. And that way it's covered, regardless of which side of the audience you're coming from. You should be able to have some recognizable terms from us here today. Okay, so what's our background with this? Well, we've been doing this realistically since officially 2006, but of course, research projects never actually start on the day that they say is official, right? There were all kinds of things going on, all sorts of things that led to it, including research-based things before 2006. But really, we say the origin point of this project is 2006, and we've been exploring what PNSE and fundamental well-being are all over the world in all kinds of populations. Our initial study was 1,200 people who purported experiencing it literally all over the world. And since then, we've had many, many people, probably 10,000, maybe even more people that have interfaced with the project in some way as a research participant. And so this is a huge global project. It's a huge global undertaking. There's never been anything quite like it before. Well, for a very long time, we just worked with people who had already transitioned. And of course, at a certain point, you want to start getting pre and post data. You want to start being able to track the actual changes that occur in people. And so right around 2010, we started to work on a transition protocol. We looked really hard, really wide and far for any group or individual that might have a reliable thing that transitioned people. Whenever possible, we do not want to reinvent the wheel. We do not want to spend time doing things that we don't absolutely have to do. And we just couldn't find anything like that. And so basically the transition rates for people who were trying to reach PNSE or fundamental well-being were very, very, very low. It seemed like all over the place when they existed at all. Oftentimes you had even very sort of major religious or spiritual teachers who couldn't point us to anyone who had actually transitioned. And we were always asking, right? We were saying, look, we need more research subjects, who in your flock, who is it that you work with or whatever that, has transitioned. And so it turned out to be relatively viewed as a relatively difficult thing back then to actually get people across the line. So we had an enormous amount of data. We really combed through that data. And we came up with our own protocol to use in research. And initially our idea was, we want to basically put people in brain scanners and things like that, and take a picture of their brain before and then take a picture of their brain afterward and see what changed. So the protocol was designed for that, but it's gone on to have a lot of other uses. It's been used with a lot of different types of research at this point. So by 2014, the protocol was pretty successful on an individual basis, and we began to experiment with our first groups. We did our first group of 6 people. 5 of those people finished the protocol, and of those 5, they were all reporting a transition either during or shortly after the protocol had been used, and so that was great. Now, it's important to keep in mind this is not a short protocol back then, right? So this is like a 3 to 4 month protocol. It takes 3 to 4 hours a day, basically. It starts off lower than that. It starts off maybe at an hour and a half, and it works its way up to a good 3.5 hours a day. So it was pretty limited in terms of the type of person that could use this. If you were someone with a young family and, you had to raise kids and you were going to work and whatever else, probably you didn't have the kind of time to participate in this. It was a lot of retirees and, a lot of single people, young professionals that had extra time at night after work and things like that really formed a lot of the initial research project. But it was very successful. It had about a 70% success rate over time in transitioning people. So for those of you that are familiar with this, I mean, if when was the last time you went to a spiritual retreat or a religious retreat that was trying to produce a shift to something like enlightenment or non-duality or persistent mystical experience or whatever, the things that we call persistent non-symbolic experience or fundamental well-being, and had anything even approaching a 2% rate of success, right? Or a 1% rate of success. And it was pretty unheard of back then. Now, I think people just accept, hey, this is something that's totally possible. We've done it with thousands of participants, and it's sort of like Roger Bannister and the 4-minute mile. Before Roger Bannister, it was like the 4-minute mile was impossible. It was beyond the bounds of human physiology. It just couldn't be done. After Roger Bannister did it, so did a whole bunch of other people, and a lot of people have since then. And so, it turned out to be like a mental perception in people's minds. Oh, this is hard. It's almost impossible. Almost nobody can do it. But that didn't turn out to actually be the case. So more recently, at the start of COVID, really, we began to derive a much more accessible protocol. It was pretty clear people needed it. We had to shut down our laboratory-based research because COVID had us all sitting at home, right? And so one of the things that we did was we created a shorter protocol. We had a pretty good idea how to do this. Really, the first 10 sessions or so of the protocol, which would have covered probably the first, let's see, on the longer protocol, that would have probably covered the first 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 weeks or so of the protocol. We basically got them compressed down into a much shorter protocol, a protocol that only took an hour and a half a day. And that was about 7 weeks long, include with everything in terms of answering our surveys and research questions and stuff like that. Then, incidentally, you can see on the screen, the success rate was 65%. That actually surprised us. We were estimating about a 60% success rate. And so that was pretty cool. But then we decided to add on another month with some of the practices that we'd left out of the larger protocol, from the original 4-month protocol. And that extra month drove the transition rates even higher. So for this research that I'm going to be talking about today, people were using the shorter protocol, but they've only had time to make it through the first 7 weeks or so of it. And so this is only reporting that first part that would normally have a 65% success rate, not the people that then, if they didn't transition in that first part, went on to try another month of practices and got to between 70 and 80% success rate, depending upon how much they did, where they stopped, all sorts of different factors. Well, let's look at a background of this particular research beyond just the general background of our research. This was a hard luck class, as we called it. That was kind of our internal phrase for it. And what we did And we were just kind of thinking to ourselves, there are all these people now who have used the protocol. And even if you have like a 70% success rate over time, that's like 30% of people that didn't transition persistently to persistent non-symbolic experience or fundamental well-being. Let's see what we can do for those folks. Let's kind of have a no seeker or, no person left behind kind of mentality about this. And so we put together a special sort of run of the protocol just for those people. We invited them back to do the protocol again. We gave them a couple of different options, one of which was the ketamine option. And there was another option that they could take where they could get some additional trauma-like therapy training for people that felt that they might have had some trauma issues that were holding them back and stuff like that. And so this class wound up being very interesting. We had a lot of people that were interested in it, about 233 people from our alumni community, if you will, the experimental alumni community. But of course, as is always the case, 233 people did not start it. 233 people were not in fundamental well-being or persistent non-symbolic experience at the beginning of it. And so by the time you sort it all down, we basically wound up with 113 people who weren't in fundamental well-being at the beginning and who went all the way through the protocol and made it to the last part of that first part of the protocol, of the basically like the 7-week version of the protocol. And you can see where some people dropped out here, the numbers of dropouts. So those dropouts aren't sorted by people. There are people in there who started off in fundamental well-being who have been excluded from the data anyway. There were people that didn't start off who could have potentially been included in this data if they've gone all the way through it. But I think it's just interesting to see how over time people drop out. A lot of people actually do make it to the later sessions. You might be thinking to yourself, well, why would someone drop out near those later sessions? Frankly, one of the reasons they do is because they've transitioned and they just kind of want to sink into persistent non-symbolic experience or fundamental well-being. They don't want to keep trying new practices. They don't want to do something that they think is going to rock the boat. Of course, we don't recommend that. We recommend that they keep going, but lots of times they don't. And you can't blame them. Sometimes these people have been wanting this for a really, really long time. They've been trying for this transition for a really, really long time, and it's finally happened, and they just want to, sink into it. Basically, other people just give up. It's certainly not everybody that transitions out of those numbers. There are other people who just get frustrated and they just drop out and they think, oh, I've only got 2 or 3 things left. This isn't going to work for me. That's even more unfortunate because we're often building towards that last 2 or 3, right? So it's not the time to drop out. But human psychology being what it is, some people do. So the data that you're going to see here comes from a mix of things. It comes from pre and post measures. It comes from some end of session reports. It comes from interactions with the research staff. It's basically just some supplemental survey collection that we did. And that's why as you look at the different tables that are going to be coming up here that present the data in different ways, there will be different numbers of people. The reason is because not everybody fills everything out. It'd be great. We'd love it if everybody filled everything out, but that's just not the way it works. And so some people fill some stuff out, some people fill other stuff out, and we just sort of get what we get and we report that. Okay, so here's our general protocol. This is really a general adult sample. It's people all over the world. It's an English speaking course and basically the protocol looks like a class. It looks like a course. And so people, from the people's perspective, they don't realize that they're going through this complicated research design. It just looks like the simple course. They log in, they're told what to do. They do what they're told, hopefully. And they just sort of progress along. It's an English language course in terms of how it's taught. So someone has to have English as a first or a second language or something like that. It's done at home. People don't have to go anywhere. It's done with videos that have been pre-recorded so that it can be consistent in terms of the instruction from one experimental cohort to the next. And it has a variety of online support mechanisms. People participate in a Facebook group that is supported by our staff, also supported by volunteers that have taken the program before them and just want to help out. There's email support. There's a chief clinician that keeps an eye on things. And so it's a really well put together well-supported program. We think it's we've been running it for many, many years now. And we're very grateful, really, for the results that it's had and the data that it's provided for us and whatnot. So there's 10 sessions, as I mentioned. The first 6 are basically 2 a week. One starts on Saturday, ends on Tuesday. The next one starts on Wednesday, ends on Friday. So what happens is, on those days, you get video instruction. Usually it's very short, and it just says, do this until the next session. And then you go away and you do that. Sessions 7 through 10 are once a week. So those last for an entire week. 7, 8, 9, and 10. Those 4 sessions basically last for a full week, and they start on Saturday. Each session involves doing exercises right when you wake up. Now, this isn't physical exercises or anything like that. It's like forgiveness and, practices like that. So right when you wake up, just before you go to sleep, just general positive psychology practices and exercises, some of the best ones out there, which are really just designed to provide psychological support for people going through the protocol. And then there's 1 hour of continuous practice at some time that's required during the day. And these are usually meditation techniques, but not always. Some of them are cognitive science-based exercises or something like that. But you basically need to put aside a solid hour at some point during the day to do these. And then sometimes there's some extra ones. So there might be during a session, a one-off, meaning done one time, positive psychology exercise, like maybe a gratitude letter or something like that. And sometimes there's a group exercise. There's something called the group awareness exercise, where people get together and they describe awareness. And so those are some things that are additional. A group awareness exercise would be an additional 60 to 90 minutes once or twice during a week, depending upon what a group decides. People are put into small groups in order to participate in the program. So we've kept that original group of 6 going. There's basically people are put into groups of about 6 people that they occasionally have to practice stuff with, but also for support. They're supposed to meet once a week on Saturdays and just check in with each other and support each other and see how it's going. So as I mentioned, part of this involved a ketamine microdosing group. So this was the first time that we've done anything like that. We didn't hand out the ketamine, this isn't some sort of complicated FDA approved research study, where we worked with the federal government to get special approval to hand out drugs to people or anything like that. What we wanted to do was a study alongside people who are already about to begin taking ketamine. And so we worked with a separate clinical program. There's companies out there and doctors' offices and stuff like that you can contact that have ketamine programs. And there's some companies now that have microdosing ketamine programs. And what you do is you basically contact those companies and they refer you to a doctor. And then if the doctor says, yes, you're approved for using this, which is usually for something like anxiety or depression, the requirements for it are often like you've been at some point prescribed antidepressants or anti-anxiety medication, things like that. There's a few health factors that they look at. And then, the clinician either says, you're approved or you're not approved. If they approve you, then that company that you initially contacted more or less does the rest. They continue coordinating with the clinical office. They get you the ketamine shipped from a pharmacy somewhere, all of that. And so they kind of serve as a single easy point of contact for microdosing ketamine within this very clinical context. So it's clinical, it's doctors, and things like that. And so we thought, okay, well, one thing that you can do with research is if you have a population and they're already going through sort of a standard clinical program like these people, you can conduct research on them, just as they're only doing that. But you can also say, hey, would you mind also doing this other thing? And you can collect research on them as they're doing the other thing and as they're microdosing ketamine and so on. And so that's basically what we did for this study. There were initially about 30 people. As you'll see, by the time we had all the data and stuff collected, it was about half that actually gave us data. And that's, not terribly uncommon for how these things often go. Microdosed ketamine is done as a lozenge, but between your cheek and gum. And so it's like a little lozenge that you take. You can adjust the dose yourself by cutting it into quarters or things like that. And so you can just sort of get shipped a lozenge. And, if someone says, oh, make it a 10 milligram dose, well, you know that you cut off a certain percentage of that lozenge. And so in that sense, there's a little bit of play in these numbers as well in terms of the dosage that people took, because, these aren't professional pharmacists or something that are like carefully measuring out each lozenge and cutting off exactly whatever. And so, there are there's a little bit of wiggle room in here in terms of dosages. And we'll take a look at the dosages in a minute. They basically went through an initial process of dosage adjustment and figuring that out and stuff before they began the protocol. So they went back and forth with the clinical ketamine people, and those people basically helped them to adjust for an initial ideal dosage for them. And then they came into the protocol. That people generally took a lozenge 20 to 30 minutes, which is about how long it takes to dissolve and get in your system and stuff, before doing the 1 hour block practice. So that's most typically when it was taken. There were some people that reported that they experimented around a little bit, that they took it a few times throughout the day and things like that. But for the most part, this is the protocol that people followed. Here's where people came to as an ideal dosage by the end of our protocol. They were allowed to continue to mess around and adjust it and whatnot. Of course, this was all in consultation with the clinical folks. And so they would go back and forth with them. They would provide feedback. They often had feedback forms and stuff like that they would fill out in terms of how they were feeling. And those would go to the clinicians and so on and so forth. And so you can see that there's a pretty wide range of dosages. And if you're familiar at all with ketamine dosages, these are very, very small dosages, right? And so there's two takeaways from this slide. One is it's not very much ketamine to get the effects that we're going to see and talk about. And two, that between, some of the people transitioned, some of the people had temporary fundamental well-being, some of the people had no fundamental well-being as a result of taking the ketamine. And there really weren't any conclusions. It's a very small number of people. So, but in those different groups, you couldn't get statistical significance because it's just too small a number of people. But if you just eyeball the numbers, it's not like, oh, wow, the people that took 40 milligrams, yeah, that's clearly what transitioned them. It was a mix in all of the different groups, which I thought was quite interesting. So there isn't some sort of ideal dosage pattern or anything that's been suggested by this particular experiment. It seems to suggest, that people need to be most in tune with and adjusted for what is best for them, which fortunately for us, since we were working with clinical providers, those people really knew what they were doing, and they helped people to make those adjustments. Let's look at some of the results. So this is people transitioning. They weren't in persistent non-symbolic experience. They weren't in fundamental well-being at the beginning of the experiment. And these are people this is what happened. So the top line here is people who transition. These are all people who transition. So everybody that transitioned to PNSE or fundamental well-being, you can see that was about 42% of people. So that's a lot lower than what we're used to seeing out of this, which is about 65% of people. However, keep in mind, these were the tough luck cases, right? These are the people who didn't transition before, or who maybe they did transition, but they fell back out of fundamental well-being for some reason. And so we actually think this is a number we're very, very happy with. This is helping kind of a hard luck population that had not had a lot of luck either getting or getting back to fundamental well-being, PNSE. So 42% is, we think, a great number. About 34% of people reached temporary. And what this means is that at the time that the protocol ended, over the course of that protocol, at some point, they had one or more temporary glimpses of fundamental well-being. It doesn't mean before the protocol started. It means during the protocol, or even, at the time when they were filling out the exit measures. That would, of course, also count because it would be within the range of the overall protocol, that they were or had been experiencing temporary periods of fundamental well-being. Now, we think that's really important because if you're experiencing these things, you can sink into them when you experience them, and sinking into them is a great way to ease a transition. So that's a big milestone for people in terms of making progress, even if it's not persistent, towards persistent. And then about 25% of people wound up with no persistent non-symbolic experience of fundamental well-being. And this meant no experience of it at all as they went. It was supposed to mean as they went through the whole program. Now, oftentimes people don't answer that quite correctly. They'll think to themselves, well, that probably means right now, even though it doesn't say that, right? But it's like, that probably means right now. So I think, no, I'm not experiencing it right now. So it's always a little bit of a question, how many of those people might be temporary versus no persistent non-symbolic experience or fundamental well-being. But, we take the data as it is. These are different types of fundamental well-being, location 1 being the most shallow, location 4 being deeper. No one round up in location 4. People can land into any one of these types. So you can go from no fundamental well-being right to location 4, which is why we include it as a catalog, or as a category here on the screen. But nobody did. And so you see a couple of people wound up in location 3, or a third type. 6 or so in location 2. Those are good, really good numbers, especially for a hard luck population like this. What you always see is that the vast majority of people land in location 1, and then the next most people in location 2. By the time you're getting to location 3 and 4, it's getting pretty rare. So so the fact that we even saw a couple of people landing in location 3 out of such a hard luck population, we thought was really great. Ordinarily, we would see more people landing in location 2 than this, and slightly less in location 1 comparatively. But again, this is that hard luck population. And then there were a couple that, for whatever reason, weren't classified, but they were known to be persistent, and so we just sort of put them in this bucket down here. So this is the entire population. It's everybody. Took ketamine, didn't take ketamine, participated in the trauma therapy stuff in addition to the protocol, maybe to the trauma therapy stuff with the ketamine, with the protocol, right? Everybody did the protocol. Then maybe they were in one of the additional groups as well. For the ketamine group, so you see we have about 16 responses at the end here from the ketamine group. It was actually higher. Now, remember, this is a very small number of people, but as we'll see later on in the slides, these people came in really not nearly as happy as the group in general. And so they had further to go in some sense. If you're familiar at all with our previous work, you know that generally speaking, happier people are more likely to transition. And these were not happier people. And so if you look at these ketamine numbers, they're pretty impressive. 44% transition rate to persistence, 44 to temporary, 13 to none. And then mostly in location 1, 1 person in location 2. If you look at ketamine plus therapy, virtually everybody participated in ketamine also participated in the sort of additional trauma exercises and stuff like that was done by our chief clinician. So you see there's a difference of 16 to 11 people on this screen relating to that. Generally speaking, the people that did not participate in the trauma type stuff, and what we might say the additional therapy type education, those people were often worse off in terms of their happiness and their sort of psychological place when they came into the experiment. And so you might think that like the people that were really the worst off would be like, oh yeah, give me everything. But in fact, many of them did the ketamine, but they didn't do the other subgroup that dealt with like the trauma training and stuff like that. So one thing that's very notable here is if you look at these numbers of 7 people transitioning overall with ketamine, 6 of those were in the ketamine plus trauma / sort of therapy type training group. And then temporary, pretty good numbers there as well, 4 out of the 7. and then 1 that was no versus 2, right? And you can see again here, 5 of the people were in location 1. So most of the location 1 people that took ketamine or that transitioned were in the therapy side of things. And that's pretty amazing. And the only person that transitioned to location 2, that person was also on the trauma therapy side, in addition to taking the ketamine. And so if you look at this final number here, 55% versus 44% versus 42%, it's looking pretty likely that you would have wanted to have taken advantage of both of those programs. Again, keeping in mind, these are very, very small numbers among the ketamine folks. However, there are small numbers of people who started the program worse off. And so, that's a nice mitigating factor. Then what about the people that didn't take ketamine? Well, they actually had a slightly lower transition rate. And so you can see there's the 7 ketamine people to make the 47, right? So that leaves us with 40 people that transition, which is about 41% versus 42% of this overall number. So there were 97 people that didn't participate in the ketamine trial. And, they did okay. For sure. They were the people who got to location 3. That wasn't done by the ketamine folks. There were more of them from the location 2 group than from the ketamine folks. Again, the ketamine folks, though, started off a little bit more challenged from a happiness standpoint. And so the non-ketamine people had a little bit of an advantage in that sense. Let's look at the reported well-being scores. This is just a 10-point scale, on a scale of 1 to 10. How much well-being would you say that you're experiencing, right? Something like that. Just a general question like that. 10 being, man, am I experiencing well-being, right? And 1 being like, what's well-being? I'm just so depressed, right? And so you can see where the scores fell here. These were the incoming scores, and these are the outcoming scores. So pre means before the experiment and before people did the protocol. Post means after they did the protocol. If you look at the ketamine group in general, notice how low they are. So this is the ketamine. These are people that they did ketamine. They may have done therapy. They may not have done therapy, but they did ketamine. No matter what else they did ketamine. And you can see that just generally they're pretty low compared to the no ketamine group coming in, right? Now, none of these folks were all that happy, frankly. These were hard luck cases that have been, trying to reach persistent non-symbolic experience, fundamental well-being, hadn't had a lot of luck. But if you look at the ketamine and therapy subgroup, so just pulling out the people that took the ketamine and the therapy and did the protocol, and you look at them versus everybody who did ketamine, including whether they did therapy or not, you can see this is a lot higher than this number. So those people that didn't do the therapy along with the ketamine, they had some low scores to drag this down from here. Okay. The post scores actually looked pretty good, right? And so the no ketamine group came up to 6.91. The ketamine group, 6.83. That's pretty darn close for having started so much lower. And then, what group would you want to be in most? Again, we see the ketamine and therapy group. Now, remember, this is just totally subjective on people's parts, right? This is just saying, hey, how good do you feel? And asking them to give us a number. So over here, you can see the percentage differences. After that, the N means how many people were in each one of these groups. The SIG means, was this statistically significant? So the asterisk means that something was statistically significant. And D is Cohen's D. So for those of you that are out there on the academic side listening to this presentation, this is the effect size associated with this. And you can see that for those of you that don't know, higher is better, right? So higher means that there was sort of more of an effect from the intervention potentially. And so, this 1.05 is obviously quite high, as is 0.94. 0.71, of course, just below what would be considered a high amount of effect. Usually that's got a 0.8 cutoff, but that's pretty darn close to it. So again, the ketamine groups really, outpacing the people who didn't take ketamine. Satisfaction with life scale. Now we're getting into academic measures, but I put this measure here because this is kind of just like asking people, hey, how happy are you? Right? So there's just a few questions on this measure, and they're those kinds of questions. They're not like tricky academic questions where they're like asking you things in different ways and trying to figure out, is this person fooling themselves? Are they really happy? That kind of thing, right? So I thought, well, this is kind of just like asking, a 1 to 10 scale, except that it asks about your satisfaction in general with your life. Now, again, people that came into the ketamine groups, not so happy, right? Lower is less happy, right? You want to be higher on this measure, but look at how much they bumped up. That's a huge increase here from 13 to 20. And the no ketamine group came in basically almost at 20 at 19.42 and just bumped up a couple of points to 21.46. 20 is a pretty high score for this. And so, these are good numbers from a post-score standpoint. You can see ketamine and therapy, again, they were way worse off than the no ketamine group, but not nearly as bad as the all ketamine group that included the people that didn't do the therapy / trauma lesson type components. And so, nonetheless, a really amazing increase of 8.78 or 61%. Again, very strong, high effect sizes for both of those ketamine groups, all statistically significant. Good evidence for which group you would have wanted to participate in for this experiment. The authentic happiness inventory is one of those academic measures. It's like, let's ask people a whole bunch of questions and see if we can figure out if we believe that they're really as happy as they say they are, kind of thing. And so here you can see the differences are actually much lower in terms of percentage changes. This is always the fascinating thing, right? And so what this is telling us is that people themselves were like, I'm so happy, or I have so much well-being, or I have so much satisfaction with life, and so on, right? But then when you ask them in more, tricky ways or designed to get under the covers a little bit more, under their hood a little bit more, and kind of, really figure out what's going on in their engine and, all of that, well, it turns out that there's actually lower increases. And the other thing that you can see here is that the pre-scores aren't nearly as broadly spread. And so again, it's the distinction between just asking someone, hey, how happy are you? And really trying to figure out how happy someone is with a well-validated academic measure. Effect sizes are also lower. They're moderate, but they're not high. For the ketamine groups, like we saw before, it's still all statistically significant, but it's an interesting additional piece of evidence between how people just subjectively feel, which of course is wonderful because that's what we're all paying attention to in our moment-to-moment existence, right? Is how we feel. But then what can actually be measured more from a scientific, more rigorous type of standpoint. Okay, what about depression scores? So this is a depression measure. It's a gold standard depression measure used widely in academic circles. And basically, if you're above 16 points, you're more like higher is worse. So if you're above 16 points, you're more or less getting into the realm where it's like you probably have some clinical symptoms of depression. So clinically depressed starts somewhere around 16 and up. Now, we can't say it's officially clinically depressed because you have to be diagnosed by a licensed clinician in order to have clinical depression. You can't just measure that off of a survey. But the way the people that do the survey research and stuff get around this kind of thing is by saying, well, if you're above 16, there's an increasing likelihood that you're going to get classified with clinical symptoms, that kind of thing. So just think of 18 as sort of a cut score for depression. The ketamine and therapy people and the ketamine people both came in above that threshold, right? And so these are people who could have been, on average, at a clinical depression, in a clinical depression type of situation. And look at where they exited. Massive drops. So they exited well below what would have been a clinical cut score. Now, the no ketamine people, they came in pretty well off to begin with, as we've been mentioning, and they wound up even better. And again, we're looking at the total population. We're not even dividing this out between people who transitioned and didn't transition. We're just saying, if you were just randomly walking into this program, how would you have done on average? Okay, so you can see the differences and all of that, and the significances and the effect size. The only really strong standout effect size here, again, is the ketamine and therapy group. Here's a summary of the percentage changes. Sometimes it's helpful to just sort of see some things collapse down onto one screen. And I think the thing that they really highlight for me is just the significant impact of ketamine and therapy, and even ketamine against the no ketamine option. So with the no ketamine option, as we saw, you were in great shape to transition to fundamental well-being. Your well-being scores were great, all of that. But in terms of really moving the needle for people who were quite bad off, that was really done with in the ketamine and ketamine therapy groups. Okay, another way to look at this is in terms of transitioning to fundamental well-being, how many people actually moved from where they came in? Because some people have been trying to do this for a long time, and when they came in, they were like, well, I'm already experiencing temporary fundamental well-being, temporary non-symbolic experience, right? It's not persistent, it's temporary, but I'm experiencing something. Other people were like, I'm not experiencing anything. So one way to think about this temporary experience, sometimes this is answered in a couple of different ways by people. Sometimes it's answered like, in the past, I've had temporary experiences, and sometimes it's answered like, right now, I'm having temporary experiences. So again, it's a little bit tricky to get some precise answers to these things, but overall, when you look at the pattern of the data, that doesn't really matter too much. So in terms of positive change, which would all of these, like no experience of temporary, no experience of location 1, no experience of location 2, and so on. That one's copied in there twice. Sorry about that. It's actually, the number down here is right, but that one obviously shouldn't be there. One of those two shouldn't be there. But you get the idea, right? And then what about people that went the other way? Well, some people did. Some people came in reporting temporary and wound up with no experience. Now, what they might have been applying there is, in the past, I've had temporary glimpses. They might not have been having them at the beginning of the program. So we can never really be too sure there. But either way, at the end of the program, we know that they were saying, I'm not experiencing fundamental well-being. So there's at least a few people that went the other way. And a lot of people just, came in temporary, left in temporary. Came in saying, I'm not experiencing anything, left saying, I'm not experiencing anything, right? So this is a really nice way to just at a summary glance say, how impactful was this really on an individual by individual basis? Okay, great. X number of people left in temporary fundamental well-being, but how many people arrived in temporary fundamental well-being, right? And so it's just some clarity for you to get a sense of this. So it impacted roughly half of people in a positive way in terms of fundamental well-being. Okay, now of those two groups, starting with the didn't experience anything group, who are they, right? Well, their pre-well-being score and their post-well-being score only had a 7% change. Only 17 of those people filled out this measure. So we don't have the whole population of 21, but we got 17 of them. And the bottom line is basically, if they came in not experiencing anything and they left not experiencing anything, they probably didn't really have much of a well-being boost by the program. So it just might not have been a well-matched program for them, or could have been any number of other factors. They might not have really done it hard, or who knows. But bottom line is, they came in and they left about the same. And that included, incidentally, 2 ketamine participants. And so from those previous numbers, you might be thinking, oh, but not the ketamine people. Look at that 50+% change. And, well, you got to look at an individual level. You got to look at this data from a whole bunch of different angles to get the whole picture of it, right? So there were, in fact, a couple of ketamine participants who came in not experiencing anything, left not experiencing anything, and look at their well-being scores. One went from a 1 in well-being to a 3. So that's a very unhappy person. Another one went from a 2 and stayed at a 2. Came in at 2, stayed at 2. Again, very unhappy person. And incidentally, that makes sense, because what we've learned from the clinical provider is that oftentimes low dose ketamine doesn't have a significant impact on very depressed people. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. It's a little bit hit and miss. And so there we see people that are probably, quite down, quite depressed, and they would fit that pattern. Okay, what about temporary to temporary experience? 22 people. We had 14 out of those 22 people fill out this questionnaire, this part of this questionnaire. Pre-well-being, 6.71. Post-well-being, 7.29, 9% change. I mean, a 10% change in well-being, roughly, that's not bad. Obviously, who wouldn't want to be 10% better? But it's not a huge change. Of those, there were 3 ketamine participants, one that didn't fill out that survey, so we don't have any data on them. One that went from 7, quite happy, to 8, again, quite happy, and another one that got less happy as part of participating in the ketamine experiment, right? They came in at an 8, and at the end, they were rating themselves as a 5. So again, you've got to look at this from different perspectives. You can't just look at those high-level numbers and think to yourself, well, that's a no-brainer. Ketamine is good for everybody with a protocol like this. It just isn't the case. You have to try to get the data, sliced up in all of these different ways. Generally speaking, yeah, you were better off, way better off to be in that group, it looks like, but it's not 100%. Right? Not everyone is matched to it. Not everyone does it make sense for. So next week, one of the things we asked was, well, if you had to do it all over again, would you use the ketamine again? And you can see that out of the 14 people that answered that question, 12 of them said yes. One of them found that the ketamine just didn't quite work out with their schedule. They only had time to do the practice in the morning, the very early morning before they went to work and had to drop the kids off and stuff. And they didn't really think it was a great idea to be microdosing ketamine. They weren't sure if it would be out of their system enough. They weren't comfortable with driving their children, having taken it not long before that, things like that, right? And so there was like a life mismatch for one of those. But another person was just like, no. So of those who are going to continue, remember I said we had the 7 weeks and then they had another month that they could do of bonus stuff. Now, as I'm making this, they're doing that month. And so we don't have those numbers yet. I'm just presenting the data from the first part of it. Of the people who were going to go on, right, those were 13 people or so. One person had transitioned, was like, I don't need it anymore. Just basically decided to just stick with where they were. And then 11 other people were like, yeah, maybe they transitioned, maybe they were temporary, maybe they hadn't transitioned, whoever those, wherever they fell in terms of those 11 people, and everybody, one of those categories, each of those categories would have been represented in those 11 people, but they were like, yes, good, definitely. If I had it to do, and some of them had extra and some of them didn't have extra, yes. And then again, the one no person was the same person that couldn't quite work out the schedule, wasn't comfortable with it being in the mornings when they were going to have to go to work, drive their kids, stuff like that. So we asked them, what do you think was beneficial about this? Why was it beneficial? And we got a lot of similar answers. It made meditation a lot easier, seemed to create a sense of quiet, calm, and detachment, one person said. Each bullet point's a different person. It was a tremendous help. It made meditating easier. It took my tendency to imagine negative outcomes when faced with challenges and changed it into seeing ways that those challenges could work out and turn into positive outcomes, basically a place of positive, proactive action instead of negative, fear-based concern and worry. It helped my attitude towards the exercises, more open and trusting. The next person, I feel like ketamine helped me to sink into the exercises more easily by making me a little less inclined to get caught up in personal thoughts, because meditation sittings felt boosted this way. It also initially served as a motivation to sit each day. I was excited to sit. Another one, I was definitely able to sink in more and stay there for most of the session. I was able to let go easier. Another one, ketamine makes me feel more alert and it quiets the narrative mind. You get to see these patterns, right? People are saying essentially similar things for what it's doing for them. You can read the rest of these on the screen. You get the gist. It was seen as like a net benefit. Now, one thing that we have in this protocol is a bunch of different methods. So there's positive psychology methods, there's meditation methods, or cognitive science-based practices. And we had people that had taken the protocol once before. These were, again, the hard luck cases. The people that had gone through the protocol weren't in fundamental well-being right now, presumably didn't transition, or if they had transitioned, maybe some of them fell out of it later on because of life stress or whatever. And so these are people who we could ask to think back. And we did. We said, okay, for method one, right? We gave them what the title of that method was, which they would recognize. Do you think, what was different about this with the ketamine? Was it better, worse? Were there pluses and minuses? Tell us about it, right? And as we looked across everyone's data, what we saw was that there wasn't a sort of a uniformity. It wasn't like, okay, wow, these 6 methods, the people that took ketamine said, wow, they just really were phenomenal with the ketamine microdosing. In fact, it was, again, kind of like an individual pattern of people. For some people, most of the methods were boosted by it. For others, some more than others. In some cases, some really had little to no interaction with the ketamine at all. Others seemed to benefit from it. And so it was a real mix, again, an individual mix of feedback and results from people. So one thing that we thought we might leave this experiment with was like, here are the 6 methods that you should use for microdosing ketamine. We definitely didn't get that. It was a very individualized thing. And it often is. In our research protocol over the years, the reason there are so many methods in it is because it is ultimately a method matching protocol. People come in and they try a bunch of stuff and they match up to some things and they don't match up to others. And we saw that same pattern was not really disrupted in any way by microdosing ketamine. If anything, it just sort of made people more at ease to get into the practices and discover which one was a fit for them. Okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Here's some websites, including nonsymbolic.org, our main research website. 45 Days to Awakening is where we're doing the transition protocol experiments and stuff right now. My personal website, Dr. Jeffrey Martin. If you're interested in participating in future experiments that we'll do in this area, please let us know. Now, you might already be microdosing stuff, and we think we're going to stay focused on ketamine for a while because obviously it's legal and there's ways to. There's a lot of medical infrastructure. It's been used forever, with all kinds of patients. It's just like this amazingly safe drug, and so it's got a great safety profile and all of that. And we're using a tiny amount of it on top of that, things like that. And so we'll probably stick with ketamine. But if you are microdosing other things just on your own independently or whatever else, I'd say, sign up and let us know. You don't have to tell us what you're doing, but just let us know that you're interested in potentially participating in this type of research as we go forward. And we'll keep in touch with you, as we open up new experiments and as it becomes possible to participate in things, we'll just, we'll send out an email to the people that sign up at this URL. And we'll take it from there. All right. Thank you so much. Again, such an honor to be with you today. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I know there's a lot of things that you could be watching and paying attention to, and I'm just so grateful that we got to spend time together today.